Well, anyway, I'd like to welcome everyone. I'm Ted Wadley. I'm the acting president of the Georgia Association of Higher Education Retiree Organizations, which we usually shorten to Georgia HERO, which is a network of college and university-based retiree organizations in the state of Georgia. I thought, since we have such a good attendance, and that rather than individual introductions, I'm going to let our speaker know the institutions represented in today's meeting. I'm also going to add 2 items to our agenda. After the presentation and the Q&A discussion, we'll have a nominating committee report and election of officers to take office on July 1st. So let me see. I've noticed that at today's meeting, we have representatives from Albany State University, Clayton State University, Emory University, Georgia College and State University, Georgia State University, in particular Perimeter College at Georgia State University, Kennesaw State University, Middle Georgia State University, the University of Georgia, the University System of Georgia Retiree Council, the University of West Georgia, and Valdosta State University. Have I left any out? Is there, I was trying to notice who was here, but that's the list that I have. Okay, in that case, I'll introduce.
Did you say Emory, Ted?
Yes, Emory University.
Oh, sorry, I missed it.
Yeah, it was number 3.
Okay.
They're at least roughly in alphabetical order. Yeah, we have several people from Emory University, and we're very grateful for the long participation from the founding of Georgia HERO, that Emory has been a good partner for Georgia HERO. Okay, in that case, I'll introduce our speaker. It's Dr. Antonius D. Skipper, an assistant professor in the Gerontology Institute at Georgia State University. His research broadly involves understanding the intersectionality of religion, relationships, and health among middle and old age African Americans. He currently works on several projects, including the American Families of Faith Project and Strong African American Couples Project, for which he analyzes aspects of coping, resilience, and religiosity across the life course. Today, he will discuss several relevant aspects of aging in families, including caregiving, dyadic relationships, social determinants of health, stress, and coping. In addition, Dr. Skipper will share research and findings from his personal work on aging in minority families. If you are caring for an older loved one or simply interested in changes associating with aging, this conversation will provide opportunities for critical thought and reflection. I can add that I myself fit into all of those categories in terms of caring for older loved ones and also for myself. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Skipper.
Thank you all for having me. I am going to go ahead and share my screen here. Slideshow view. All right. Is everything showing good?
Yes.
Awesome. Awesome. Again, thank you all for having me. I'm Antonius Skipper, an assistant professor of gerontology at Georgia State University. Very honored to come and to share with you all today, largely about just aging and older adults. And it's one of those topics that you know, the young adults, particularly in the university system, they'll always be like, you study old people? I don't like old people. Like, listen, this is the one group that you'll join if you're lucky. Like, we're all trying to get there. I promise you it beats the alternative. And I often share that, with my students, like, we may not all be millionaires, but we can be all be older adults if we're, taking care of ourselves and doing good. And so I come to you today to kind of share a little bit about families and aging. So to begin, I want to just kind of offer a presentation roadmap. And I promise this is more for myself to keep me on track as opposed to you all. But I'm going to begin by just discussing some basics of aging, some natural things that occur with aging, some natural aspects of gerontology and things that go on with gerontology that many of us may already be aware of, from whether it's caring for ourselves or caring for aging parents or grandparents. And then I'm largely going to focus much of my talk on caregiving. And so I'll talk about dyadic caregiving and spousal caregiving and caring for an aging parent and all of the different things that kind of come with caregiving, along with thinking about caregiver burden, some of the outcomes associated with caregiver burden, some of the practical considerations for caregiving. I'll then move on to talking about some other social determinants of health that we've really kind of dived into in studying older adults. And I'll finally close by talking about my research agenda, which largely encompasses two projects right now: a vaccine hesitance project geared around COVID-19, and also the Strong African American Families project, in which I look at enduring African American couples. And so that will be our presentation. I anticipate it to be 40 to 45 minutes or so, maybe a little bit longer. But that's kind of the roadmap of where we'll go. And so to begin, I want to just jump into talking about living in an aging society. What we're experiencing right now has been referred to as this graying of America. And it's honestly a graying of the world, because we are seeing these things happen across the world. People are living longer. We have, a lot more older adults now than we did in decades past. If we look at the U.S. age pyramid there on the left, we'll see the very dark kind of burgundy color that was in the 1900s. And so you have 0 to 4 years of age at the bottom, and then it goes all the way up to age 85 plus. And then as we go to 1950, as we go to the year 2000, and finally looking forward to the year 2050, we see that we have just as many folks over the age of 85 as we have children that are between the age of 0 to 4. And so this really speaks to the graying of America, where we have this huge boom in the population, which originally kind of started with the baby boomers, but now is continuing to grow as people are living longer. And the fastest growing segment of the population are the individuals that are 85 plus. And so many of us are living for much longer than we would have in decades past. We have a similar chart there on the right that kind of shows the trajectory going from the year 2015 out to 2060. The green bar is the 65 to 85 group, or 65 to 84 group, and the purple bar is the 85 and older group. So we see that both are rising, but we are especially seeing a rise in those that are 85 and older. So today, about 16% of the population is over 65. That'll be about 21% by 2040. Once we get to 2050 and we begin to look at world changes in population, about 1 in every 6 people will be over the age of 65. Those are a lot of older adults. And so whereas now we're around 700 million, maybe 750 million around the world that are 65 and older, by the time we get to 2050, we project that number to be about 1.5 billion. So that number is going to double over the next 20 to 30 years or so. So in thinking about aging and what all of this means, I wanted to talk a little bit about some natural changes of aging versus ageism. And I think, Ted kind of set the stage for this when he referenced his vision and some of the things that may naturally occur with aging. And we refer to these things as senescence. And one of the main ones that we notice, and it's not really in older adulthood. It's actually in middle adulthood, but about 40 or 50 years of age, we start to see changes in our vision. And we may all, or many of us may experience presbyopia, which is this natural change in our eyes where we have more difficulty seeing things that are close up. So for those like myself who wear glasses to see things far away in younger adulthood, we get to middle adulthood and now we start to have the bifocals. My dad, who is, I guess he's still, fairly young. He's 56, 57, somewhere around there. But I started to joke with him now because every time we're out at the restaurant, he is, I can't see this. Or when we're playing board games, he's holding the cards up. I can't see this. And growing up, the dad that was, this very masculine, macho type guy it's a completely different thing for me to see. So I often joke with him, knowing very well that I'm following in his footsteps. Another thing that is changing with aging, that changes with aging often is our hearing. We may have more difficulty hearing high-pitched sounds, which kind of counters what we see in a lot of long-term care facilities, because when we get into ageism and we notice how people talk to older adults, it's often with a high-pitched voice and they're talking slower and they're talking to people often as if they have some kind of cognitive impairment. That's more difficult for the older adult to hear many times due to the natural changes that can occur with our hearing. The generation now, those young adults and those millennials have been referred to as generation deaf, because if you've noticed, now everybody walks around with the earbuds on. And so in thinking about how that is going to play out in 30, 40, 50 years, they're now referring to those in the millennial group as generation deaf because they anticipate that many of them will have hearing issues. Another change that occurs with aging is that reaction time changes. And so older adults may not react as fast as they did in their younger years. We have natural changes that occur with aging. When we think about the heart grows fattier, the heart hardens in certain places. And so many times we see heart disease become an issue in older adulthood. And then the last one I want to touch on is the change in ability to regulate your own temperature. And many of us may think of older adults. I remember being a young kid going to my grandma's house and it was always hot. And why is it so hot in here? Why don't you turn the heat down just a tad? And then as I got into gerontology, I grew to understand that the layer of skin that's just beneath, the layer of fat that's just beneath the skin grows thinner in older adulthood, which contributes to many older adults getting colder easy and also bruising easy. And so those are some natural changes that may occur. Those things counter with much of what we see in relation to ageism. And we see quite a bit of ageism, not just from young adults, but from older adults as well, and that they buy into many of the stereotypes that are associated with aging, whether that is, well, older people drive slow. Well, older people are mean. Well, older people are stubborn. All of the stereotypes that are associated with growing older, and many of the things that I hear from students all the time, simply because they've heard these things all of their lives, and these things are often shared in the media. If we think about cartoons, many times the older adult character in the cartoon is often the bad person or the bad guy. Many times in cartoons, if we think about things such as Up, which I love the film, but it is a lot of ageism in and within that film. If we think about even the movie Cars, there's a lot of ageism in and within that film. And so these are things that we're telling children at very young ages. Also shows such as Golden Girls. Great film, but there are a lot of things that are ageist in there, and older adults are often seen as the butt of the joke. And when we go to the local CVS, we see these gift cards that make it seem like growing another year older really isn't all that great, whether it's talking about being over the hill or some of the sexual changes that may occur with aging, or some of the difficulties that may occur with aging in relation to hearing or other things. Like, there's so much ageism embedded in our society, and oftentimes we just laugh at it and turn a blind eye to it as if it's not as serious as the other isms, when it is in fact just as serious. And so thinking about those things and being aware of those things is one of the things that we all want to do and kind of help to counter ageism together. So placing this all into context, like what does all of this, the basics of aging really mean? And that's where I want to kind of transition into discussing caregiving a little bit. And I love this quote from First Lady Rosalind Carter, who says there are only four kinds of people in the world: those who are currently caregivers, those who have been caregivers, those who will be caregivers, and those who will need caregivers. And so many of us will fall into one of those groups, if not several of those groups, particularly when we think about informal caregiving. A lot of times when we think about aging and long-term care and things of that nature, we think about the nursing home, we think about assisted living, but in reality, most folks live at home. Only about 5% of our older adult population live in some form of long-term care facility. That means that most older adults are community dwelling, and many of them that need help will need help in their own home. Many of them are not already receiving services, which means that either their spouse is helping to provide some kind of service, or a child or a grandchild or somebody is there to kind of support them and provide this aspect of caregiving. We've talked about the growing number of older adults in society. And so when we think about that, in addition to a shrinking pool of informal caregivers, simply because people aren't having children in the same way that they did decades ago. If we go back several decades, we see that it was normal to have, 5, 6, 7, 8 children. Whereas now many of the folks that are having children are only having 1, 2, or 3 children. And so we're going to have a lot of older adults, but a very small pool of informal caregivers, which contributes to what has been referred to as a caregiver crisis, in which we're going to have to do a better job of taking care of older adults that are in need of care. So thinking about who becomes a caregiver, the caregiver profile. Most caregivers are women, most are female. In fact, the data suggests that for those with children, you'll spend more time in the second half of your life caring for an aging parent or a spouse than you will caring for someone that was between the age of 0 and 18. So women generally spend more time as caregivers in older adulthood than they do in their younger years when they're actually taking care of their children, which is a very interesting statistic. Oftentimes it is spousal care that's being provided. Many times those that are caring for older adults are older adults themselves, and so they may have their own issues that are going on. And oftentimes these folks, especially in middle adulthood, may be in what's referred to as the sandwich generation. So the sandwich generation are those that are caring for a young child, a school-age child, at the same time that they may be caring for an older adult who is often a parent or a grandparent. There are also some cultural differences that contribute to who may be a caregiver. And so in some cultures, particularly when we think about Eastern culture, it's more common for there to be this collectivist nature in which we don't place mom or we don't place grandmom in long-term care. They come to live with the family. If we think about this concept of filial piety in Asian cultures, it's the norm for the female child in the family to care for her aging parents. And if there isn't a female child there, oftentimes that responsibility will fall to the daughter-in-law. And so we see that there are these cultural differences that play a role in who may be a caregiver as well. Whereas in other societies that are a bit more individualistic, we may not have those same caregiver characteristics. So conditions commonly requiring caregiver, one of which includes memory issues. So if we think about Alzheimer's, if we think about dementia, which are two of the big ones, of course, Alzheimer's is simply a form of dementia. But two of the big ones that really kind of contribute to caregiver burden, which we'll talk a little bit about in just a moment. And the reason is because you're kind of watching your relationship with this person change over time. You're watching this person lose their sense of self over time. It's typically in a round the clock 24-hour caregiver situation. And it can be very difficult for caregivers that are caring for someone who is experiencing Alzheimer's or another form of dementia. Cancer is another one that is commonly requires caregiving. Parkinson's disease, which is also associated with Alzheimer's, and then cardiovascular disease. As I've already shared, in older adulthood, we start to see the results of many of the things that we did in younger adulthood, which can often contribute to heart disease, contribute to changes in the heart, and then lead to situations in which we may need someone to care for us. Caregiving can last from a matter of weeks to many, many years. You know, if you're caring for someone that has Alzheimer's, that can go on for 15, 20 years or so. And so the range of time that someone may be in their caregiving role can actually vary significantly. So caregiver burden, what is it? And I love the definition of caregiver burden, because I think it really touches to the diverse nature of the construct. But it's the extent to which caregivers perceive that caregiving has had an adverse effect on their emotional, social, financial, physical, and spiritual functioning. And so I think it's important to recognize that with caregiver burden, perception is reality. And so it's not going to look the same for two people. Whereas one person may be able to take on a huge load, another person may not be able to do as much, or may not be able to serve in the caregiving role as well. And I think it's also important to recognize that caregiver burden touches on many different aspects of a whole being. And so it's not just physical burden, or it's not just taking an emotional toll, but it can affect every single aspect of your lives, particularly if you are caring for a loved one, or you are spending several hours in the caregiving role. And so it's definitely important to have those conversations. And we'll talk a little bit more in just a second about some of the things that may occur at the doctor's office. But it's important to recognize that a lot of caregivers experience caregiver burden, and it has real life impact, real life outcomes, as we're sharing in just a second, across, a number of different domains in a person's life. So thinking about some risk factors that are associated with caregiver burden, one of which, of course, is being a female sex, simply because being a female places you in a position in which you are more likely to be a caregiver anyway. Low educational attainment, which could also tie into financial strain and financial well-being, can be a risk factor for caregiver burden. Residing with the care recipient. So when there is, a residential situation in which you may be caring for a spouse that resides with you, or a loved one that resides with you, that is around the clock care. And many times that can contribute to a higher rate of caregiver burden. Also, if you're experiencing things yourself, such as depression or social isolation or financial stress, if you've cut yourself off from your social network or stopped doing the things that you enjoy, then that can contribute to a higher rate of caregiver burden. It's important to remember when you're caring for a loved one that one of the things that you really want to do is spend time with that person outside of caregiving. Do something else, whether it's watching a film together, whether it's going to the park together. Just do something to kind of take you out of the role of always having to feel like you have to stay home and simply play the caregiving role. Enjoy this person and continue to love this person and be there for this person, but do so in doing something that you both will enjoy. Another risk factor is a higher number of hours spent caregiving. So the more time that you spend in the caregiving role, the more likely you are to experience caregiver burden. Many of us may not see ourselves as caregivers simply because we're not around the clock caregivers, but many of us are, in fact, caregivers, whether you are even living outside of the home from someone and you're helping to pick up groceries, or you're helping to pick up medications, or you're running them to a doctor's appointment, or, you're doing several of those small tasks that oftentimes don't get considered when thinking about informal caregiving, yet and still you are a caregiver. And then the lack of choice in being a caregiver. And so if it's something that's kind of pushed on someone and they didn't really have any say so or any choice in whether they wanted to take on that role, that can contribute to a higher rate of caregiver burden as well. So thinking about the outcomes of caregiver burden, caregivers have a higher rate of morbidity and mortality than those who are not caregivers. There was this longitudinal study by Schultz and Beach in '99, which found that caregivers of older adults who experience caregiver burden or caregiver strain have a mortality rate nearly 70% higher than non-caregivers. In many instances, when people take on the role of caregiving, their health will grow worse than the health of the person that they're actually caring for. In some instances, they will actually die before the person that they are caring for, particularly if they are experiencing caregiver strain or caregiver burden. We actually talked about caregiving in class just last week. Well, no, that was this week. That was Tuesday. We talked about caregiving in class just this Tuesday. And one article that we read was from a wife who was 84 years old. Her husband was 86 years old. And in the article, she talks about attempting suicide 3 times. And, you know, she goes on to talk about how she was attempting suicide and it was just too much for her to bear, but her husband wouldn't allow her to use any resources or bring anybody else into the family, and how it was just so difficult for her. There was another article that talked about men as caregivers. And in one of the articles, one of the men talked about how he wanted to conduct his interview while he was at dialysis because that was the only break that he got from being a caregiver. Any other time he was caregiving. And so it's important to see that caregivers really are like these invisible patients. Many times they go into physician offices and the physician is trained to see problem, fix problem. So he's talking, you know, about the issues with the older adult. And here we have a caregiver that may be experiencing depression, anxiety, isolation, hypertension, poor health themselves, all as a result of caregiving. But nobody is really asking about that. And so in many instances, we have to do a better job of recognizing that there are supports out there for caregivers. There are support groups, there are resources, there's respite care, there's all of there out there to kind of support the caregiver and give them the resources that they need so that they're not experiencing caregiver burden and the negative outcomes of caregiver burden. And so some other outcomes, in addition to mortality, some that are related to morbidity include a decreased immune system functioning. So people are getting sick more, elevated blood pressure, which of course is tied to hypertension, and then cardiovascular disease is also associated with caregiving. Less social interaction and free time, which will contribute to social isolation. So you may have less time for activities with other family members, or less time for your hobbies, or less time for vacations. And in many instances, caregiving becomes an identity. For some people, it can actually be a welcoming identity in retirement. When we tie our entire, life to what it was that we were in our previous years. So you may say, well, I'm a professor, and you've been a professor for 30 years. And then one day you retire and it's like, well, who am I? And there can be this identity crisis in older adulthood as a result of tying so much of ourselves to our profession. And so for some people, caregiving may actually become a filler for that kind of vacancy, and they may take on their identity as a caregiver. But it's still important to remember that in that role, it's important to take breaks. It's important to, have time away. In the profession, we may have sabbaticals, or we may have a semester where we can only focus on our research or things of that nature. And so it's still important to remember to take some time away from that role if you are in a caregiving role. There's a major time commitment that's associated with caregiving, which can contribute to morbidity, and then the financial hardship and disrupted work. And so it can be costly to serve in the role as a caregiver. And if you're still working, it can be difficult to juggle your schedule so that you're able to be there for your loved one in the way that you may feel that you need to be. So the psychological consequences, and I wanted to share this chart really quick, just to show that there are a range of different things that we can do within the caregiving role. And so the first one in this care trajectory, it recognizes this kind of sporadic care, which is generally outside of the home. You are doing light errands, you're helping with bill pay, you're just checking in, you are taking them to doctor's appointments. And so you may experience some anxiety, you may experience a little bit of burden, and there may be a need for some intervention there, but largely you are just kind of caregiving every now and then and helping out a little bit. It may be seen more as helping out. And then we move to the second one, which is where we get into IADL care. So instrumental activities of daily living, which include things such as monitoring your medication. It includes things such as financial assistance. It includes things such as grocery shopping. It includes things such as coordinating care. And so now you are a little bit more involved in the life of the older adult, and you may experience a little more burden or a little more distress. If we continue on, we begin to get into ADL care, which is where now you're helping with feeding, you're helping with toileting, you're helping with all forms of personal care, you're monitoring their behavior and locations. And so this is where we really start to see an uptick in risk for morbidity and mortality as a caregiver. The next stage is placement, if you actually place them into a home. And so that into a nursing home or either long-term care. And so that can be associated with some psychological consequences, whether it's complicated grief or whether it's ambiguous loss, this idea that they're still there, but they're not really there, or these feelings of guilt and anxiety from having placed your loved one in a personal care facility. And then finally is with the death of the older adult or the person that you've been caring for. And the research suggests that it's often accompanied by this relief or this recovery, which can be also complicated grief because people who weren't in the caregiving role may not understand how you're experiencing relief or recovery as a result of the death of a loved one. But in the instance that I was just sharing, the story of Miss D that we talked about in class on Tuesday, when her husband died is when she felt the most relief from the caregiving role. And she would begin to kind of re-engage in her own social network and do things herself as a result of her husband's death. So some practical considerations of caregiving. Think about who should become a caregiver. One thing to remember is to respect the wishes of the person that's being cared for. It's kind of important and it's often overlooked. Many times it's a conversation of, well, who can care for mom or who can care for dad? And that becomes the essence of the conversation. But it's important to remember that we're dealing with a person here, and this person should have a voice in their own care. And so thinking about and respecting the wishes of the person that's being cared for is very important. Also, personality characteristics. If these two people haven't jailed their whole life, chances are that's not the best caregiver for this person. And so thinking about those things and considering those personality characteristics, which is often why we see that spousal caregivers do very well, because oftentimes they've been together for many years and they know one another, and they develop this relationship over several decades often. And so there's some mesh there in relation to their personality. You want to think about the quality of the relationship before caregiving. You want to think about the sacrifices in time and financial resources. Who has the time to actually serve in the role as caregiver? Who has the financial resources to actually serve in the role of caregiver or can assist in the role of caregiving? And think about the level of comfort in both undertaking and receiving intimate care. So if we're helping out with ADLs and this level of personal care, a dad may not be comfortable with his daughter assisting him with toileting, or a mom may not be comfortable with her son assisting her with toileting. And so we want to make sure that we're having these kinds of conversations and understanding where there may be these intimate boundary lines that we don't want to cross in both undertaking and receiving this care from a caregiver. Some more things to consider. As a caregiver, one thing we want to talk about is scams and frauds, which has grown more common during COVID-19. And if we think about it, like, so many of us got up and we went to jobs every single day. And if you think about someone who is a fraud artist or a scammer, like, this is their job. And so in the same way that we wake up, we go to work, we go do research, we go teach classes, many of these folks, this is what they do. And many of them prey on older adults because they know that many older adults are at home during the day, they're going to answer the phone. And so many of them take advantage of this. The leading form of abuse for older adults is financial abuse. Believe it or not, oftentimes the person that they are being abused by in relation to financial abuse is a child. A very common fraud that goes on with older adults is this grandparent scam, probably one of the more common forms of a fraud or scam. And the way it goes is that they'll receive a phone call and they'll say, "Grandma, do you know who this is?" Typically how it always starts. And the grandma will oftentimes guess a name. And she'll say, "Jerry?" And you'll be like, "Yeah, this is Jerry, your favorite grandchild. I've been in an accident. I broke my jaw or I broke my nose, something, and I need you to wire me money right now." And because most grandparents love their grandchildren or have a special place in their grandchildren their grandchildren have a special place in their lives, many times they, hurry up and send whatever it is that they need. And a very, very common scam. And the way that they'll find names is many times they will search online for names that sound older, or they'll search a phone book for names that sound older. And they're just making hundreds of calls a day to say, "Grandma, do you know who this is?" And so it's something that we definitely want to be aware of. Another scam that's going now, particularly as online dating grows, is this romance scam, where they may meet someone online. This person may develop a relationship with them, and then all of a sudden there's this urgent need, which is one of the red flags in relation to scams and fraudulent behavior. So those red flags include, that urgency in the pitch. "Hey, I need you to do this right now. I need you to send me something right now. I'm in jail, or, I'm in the hospital and I need this money immediately." Another thing to consider is, how they want payment. So if it's a wire transfer or ACH transfer or something like that, oftentimes that can contribute to fraud. If they're receiving emails, many of us may know to look for misspellings in an email. I can't tell you how many times a day I get an email from Amazon that's not from Amazon, but it's constant, telling me to change my account password or do something in my account. Thinking about, is it solicited or is it unsolicited? So unsolicited will absolutely be a red flag. Does it appeal to your emotions, which the grandparent scam oftentimes does, simply because people understand the bond between a grandparent and a grandchild. My mom tells me if she knew, that grandchildren were so much fun, she would have skipped over having me and just had them. Not sure how I feel about that, but here we are. And then thinking about, is it too good to be true? Oftentimes, if it feels too good to be true, as many of us may know, then it is. But these are conversations that we want to have with our older loved ones, that we want to have with, our parents or whoever that may be receiving these phone calls, and also things that we want to be aware of ourselves, so that we don't fall victim to one of the scams or one of the frauds that are really targeting older adults. So in thinking about caregiving for your parents, or honestly, in thinking about, this can be caregiving in general, even caregiving for an older spouse, when to play the bad guy. And I think this is one of the harder conversations to have, is when it's time to do something that makes you the bad guy, because we all want to be liked, and, you know, we want our parents to know that we love them, or we want our spouse to know, or our partner to know that we love them. And so it's difficult to kind of play the bad guy for an older adult in our lives. But one thing that you want to think about is when your partner or your mom or dad or whoever can no longer drive safely. And this can be a huge issue, not just for the older adult themselves, but for people that are on the road. This is often one of the more difficult ones to navigate, because driving gives us so much autonomy. And even in older adulthood, we want to maintain our autonomy. Like, no, this is my life. I can do what I want, you know. And so it can be difficult to kind of get people to give up the keys to their car, or give up driving. And so I've done a number of things kind of in this arena. I remember working with one family, and this gentleman, he only wanted to go to Dunkin' Donuts in the morning to have coffee. That was it. He lived fairly close to the Dunkin' Donuts. I worked with the family. He was still driving. He would not give up his keys for anything. So I worked with the family. We figured out a way for this gentleman to get from his house to the Dunkin' Donuts and back home by only making right turns. Now, it took him a while to get to Dunkin' Donuts, but the family no longer had to worry about him turning across lanes of traffic. And so that was, you know, kind of a creative thing that we did to allow this gentleman to maintain his autonomy in driving. I remember working with another family, and this is something that you may want to think about when it's time to take away the keys, or, you know, or have that conversation. And all we did was to disable the car. And, you know, I was in a role as a resident service coordinator, you know, at the time. The DMV simply would not intervene. Like, I had done everything with the DMV and the city of Atlanta police to try and get them to intervene, and they just weren't doing it. And so finally I got the family, you know, to buy in and disable the car so that the car would no longer start. And, you know, their mother had no idea why the car wouldn't start, but that was what had been done. And it was honestly with her safety in mind. There may be instances where you want to have conversations with the physician and get the physician to talk to the older adult to say, hey, I don't think it's necessarily safe anymore for you to be driving. You may want to involve the DMV and have the older adult, which is, you know, your legal right to have a driving assessment done. And then the DMV can then revoke the license of the older adult. Person that I was working with, it didn't matter if they took her license. She was going to drive, and she was, you know, very set on that. She let us know that she will drive without a license if need be. Another thing that we want to think about in caregiving is when the house may be an unsafe place to live. We want to encourage aging in place. You know, we want people to be able to live where they want to live and not have to go into long-term care. But many times we have to make changes within the home so that people can live safely. 1 in 3 older adults experience a fall every year. One of the risk factors associated with fall is the fear of falling. So once people start thinking about falling and having this fear of falling, they actually increase their likelihood of having a fall significantly. And that can be, you know, brought on by a previous fall. And so we want to make sure that we're kind of fall proofing the home, making sure that, you know, we're looking for any rugs that may stick up or any cords that run across the floor. We want to make sure that we're putting supportive devices in place, whether it's grab bars in the restroom, or doing all of these things to make home a safe place for our older adults. You want to intervene when someone may be mismanaging medication, and you may want to assign a person or a caregiver to actually manage that medication for them, or they even have pill bottles that you may be able to only open at a certain time, or it can track when the bottle has been opened. And so they have all of these things that are in place that can better monitor medication. And then when an older adult is displaying signs of depression, we see that older adults have a fairly high rate of suicide in comparison to middle-aged adults and even young adults. And so we always want to recognize things such as depression, things such as social isolation, things such as disengagement, those things that can point to something may be wrong. With older adults, the will to live plays a huge part in mortality and actually living. If we think about two of the leading social contributors to death, one of which is being placed in a nursing home or a long-term care facility, many times people lose that will to live. And the other is the loss of a spouse or a very close loved one, in which older adults may also lose that will to live. And so we see that simply keeping people engaged, keeping people happy in older adulthood really does go a long way in adding years and years to their lives. So some other topics in aging, thinking about, social determinants of health, religion, health, and aging. By and large, we see that religion plays a positive role in health and health outcomes. We know that older adults tend to become more religious and or more spiritual in their older adult lives. Thinking about food security and nutrition, being sure that we're eating the right things, doing the right things, actually losing weight in older adulthood can be more of a sign that something is wrong than gaining weight. We tend to gain weight in middle adulthood, but for older adults, if they're losing weight, we really want to kind of take note of that and see what's going on as a result of that weight loss. Transportation is one of the bigger ones that play a role in, getting to doctor's appointments, getting to healthy food options, simply being able to get around. Transportation is a huge social determinant of health. We've already talked about the importance of remaining socially connected and avoiding loneliness, relationship status, not just married, but oftentimes simply having a loved one there, whether that's a partner or we're seeing that cohabiting rates are skyrocketing in older adulthood. People are choosing to live together apart. And so simply having someone that's there, kind of in your social corner, in your social network can be huge in relation to health. And then, of course, financial security, because money plays a role in so many different aspects. My current work largely touches on religion, relationships, and health of older African Americans, particularly thinking about dyadic relationship and spousal couples. And so on the next two slides, I want to share a little bit about my own work and what it is that I'm doing at this time before we close the presentation. So this project that I'm working on is called Vaccine Hesitance and Coping. And this is actually with funding, internal funding from Georgia State University. It's a pilot study and hopefully going to propel me to a bigger pot of money. The way this project came about is I'm sitting in these meetings, and this is, I came to Georgia State during the pandemic in 2020, in the prime of the pandemic. And I'm sitting in these meetings and people are talking about, older African Americans and why and how we're going to get the vaccine to these older African Americans. And they're saying, let's just, put some transportation in the neighborhoods that'll take them to get the vaccine. Let's just set up a shop in their community that's going to give the vaccine. Let's pass out some flyers. Let's do all this education. Let's do all of this stuff. And I'm sitting there like, that is not it. Like, I just from my work with older African Americans to date, I'm like, I think there's more to it than this. And so I applied for this pilot funding to really go out in the communities and interview older African Americans who had refused the vaccine to understand why they had actually refused the vaccine. And so it was a qualitative project, conducting interviews. I ended up with, so far, 22 African-American couples. This is work that is still going on. 22 African-Americans, I'm sorry, not couples, that are over the age of 55. And most of these individuals are in the southern US states. So to talk about some of my early findings and some of the things that are really popping out, I anticipated that religion would be there and be a factor in vaccine hesitance in some way. I didn't know that it would be kind of this two-part thing, where religion is serving as a justification for not getting the vaccine. I'm not getting the vaccine because of my religion. I don't need the vaccine because I have religion. And then religion is serving as a coping mechanism where I didn't get the vaccine, and religion is helping me to deal with any consequences that come from not getting the vaccine. Religion is helping me to cope with not getting the vaccine. So I thought it was very interesting to see kind of this two-sided thing in relation to religion and health among these older African Americans. I also saw this communal decision making where, you know, it would be an instance where, well, I didn't get the vaccine because my husband said that we're not getting the vaccine, or I didn't get the vaccine because my partner said that we're not getting the vaccine. And so there was this kind of communal decision making as people kind of navigated these things with someone else. And that someone else really kind of played a part in whether they decided to get the vaccine or not. And then lastly, there was this political determinant of health, or this political affiliation as a determinant of health. I think the timing of the pandemic, the transition of, the transition of what was going on in policy and politics at the time, and just the entire way that much of it was politicized played a role in whether people felt comfortable getting the vaccine or not. And so I thought that was very interesting, because going in, what I expected was a lot of talk about what had happened in the past and what was history from, the Tuskegee syphilis experiment and all of those things. And I really didn't hear much of that, but I heard much more of what was going on in the present time, and kind of this notion that my political affiliation is playing a role in my decision about whether to get the vaccine, which can or cannot impact health outcomes. So that's a project I'm currently working on. And the other project I'm currently working on is this older African-American couples project. And this is with data from the American Families of Faith. So one thing that I recognize, and this is why I was at Louisiana State University, working with Dr. Lauren Marks, some students approached and they said, why is it that when we talk about strong couples, the pictures in our textbook look a certain way, but when we get to the sections on divorce and stuff like that, we start to see some Black families present. So Dr. Marks and myself, we went to the literature, and what we noticed was that in discussing Black families in general, much of the research has this deficit lens. We talk a lot about absentee fathers, dads not home, divorce, why, these relationships aren't working. We talk a whole lot about that when we're talking about African-American couples, and nobody is talking about the strengths of African-American couples. And so that's really where we started to develop this project, to look at strong African-American couples and some of those things that are contributing to enduring relationships. So to date, we have data from 42 strong African-American couples in middle and late adulthood. And this is all qualitative work. And so we're sitting down with these folks having, 1 to 2 hour interviews, and very simply asking these dyads, like, how did you do it? The data says that, African-American couples don't stay together. All of this in research is saying that African-American couples don't stay together. You're experiencing systemic and institutional and all of these different issues that other couples that don't look like you aren't experiencing. And some of these things are tearing other couples apart, but yet here you are 50 years later saying that it worked. And so these are some of the most profound interviews that I've been, fortunate to be a part of, and kind of countering this deficit narrative. I recognize that we do so much comparative research, and there are issues with this comparative research, because anytime we compare two of anything, if I ask, what do you like, a apple or orange? One of them is going to be better than the other. Anytime we're comparing two of anything, one thing is going to be seen in deficit. So long we've done this comparative research with Black families and white families, which gives us great information, but most times it's pointed to Black families being in deficit. And so there's this importance to recognize that something's going on within group. We don't even understand within group differences to be able to compare these two different groups just yet. And so that's really where this older African-American couples project comes from, and understanding within group variance and within group processes that are associated with building long-lasting relationships. And so some existing papers that I have on this topic includes intercessory prayer as a relational boom. I remember sitting in a training from Dr. Harold Koenig, who is, largely the guru in health and aging, or religion in health. And he says, you don't do research on intercessory prayer. That's a topic you do not touch, because that is trying to prove the existence of a higher power, and they will eat you alive and throw you out of the institution. And then as I analyze this data, and I'm like, these couples are saying that they made it 50 years because she was praying for him or he was praying for her, even when they didn't know that they were praying for one another. Like, they are really on this intercessory prayer thing. And so I wrote the paper, and I'm glad to say that the paper is published with Family Relations. And so it's, one of those that I'm really proud of. I also have a paper out on advice from strong African-American couples, where these couples are simply saying how they did it, how they survived so long. And they're noting that communication was a big part of their relationship. Financial understanding was a big part of their relationship. And egalitarianism, this role reversal, and being able to take on multiple roles within their marriage helped them to stay married for 30, 40, or 50 years. Communal coping and stress, how these couples are working together and dealing with those stressors that they may experience in their relationship. And then relational sanctification as a boon, which gets back to that religiosity piece. And what I've noticed in that aspect is that it is largely the relational sanctification, or the degree to which the husband recognizes that his relationship is sacred, that contributes to strong African-American marriages in these heterosexual relationships. So very interesting to see, Black men, older Black men particularly, who have been absent in research for a very, very long time, begin to have a voice and kind of share their story in relation to religiosity and relationships. And so that is it for me. I tried to stay within time. I think I did okay. But I thank you all for having me. I thank you for your time. I thank you for giving me the opportunity to share. And I am only now realizing that I didn't include my email here. So I will include it in the chat if anyone wants to be in touch with me.
Thank you so much, Professor Skipper. That was really fantastic. And now if people have questions or comments, if you will go to the reactions button at the bottom of your screen and click the raise hand, I'll recognize you so that you can ask a question or make a comment. And if it's okay, I'll go ahead and stop your screen share so that
okay, yes.
We can. Okay, anyone have a question or comment? Aha, Martha Wicker.
I was just wondering, of the three reasons that you identified for the older African Americans not getting vaccinated, the three reasons: the religion, the political affiliation, and the spousal decision. What one was the major one that you found? What was the percentage breakdown of those reasons?
That's a good question. So by and large, and I only asked one question about it, right? The question was, how does religion or spirituality play a role in whether in your decision to not receive the vaccine? And so that was the only question I had in the 20-item interview protocol. But yet, in every other aspect, that kind of came out. And I would say religion played the biggest role in their decision, whether it was religious justification or this idea of a religious coping. All throughout the interview, they were, quoting religious scripture and religious doctrine, and talking about the beliefs of clergy and their religious leaders, and they talked to their pastor about it and all of this different stuff. And so it was interesting to really kind of see that it came forward in that way, because I've always had this interest in religion and health, but I wanted to do something a bit more broad to really understand why these folks are not getting the vaccine. Where's the hesitance there? And yet and still, we saw that religion jump to the forefront, which we know. I think so of the 22 adults, 14 were women, 8 were men, and we know that older African American women are have the highest rate of religiosity of any other group in the US.
Okay, other questions or comments, just raise your hand. And if you have,
Gray, I cannot raise my hand because I can't find it.
okay, that's fine. I was going to say if anyone had difficulty to to let me know. So go ahead, Dorothy.
I wanted to ask about the paper on advice from strong couples. Because you said you published it in a journal of, I don't know what it was called. And I'm wondering how, if one of the goals is to have younger couples reading that information, how do they know where to find it, and are they reading it?
That is a great point. So it's actually in family. That's why it's in family relations. It was 2021, so it's fairly recent. So that's always, kind of the issue with being in higher education, right? Is because especially with I feel like my research is the people that I want to have read my research and the hands that I want to get it into, I'm not sure that it's getting there from being published in these journals. So I'm thankful to Georgia State because they actually wrote an article based on they actually wrote, a lay article based on the research article to share more broadly with, alumni and people that are in the community. And so that will kind of point them there. In addition, I have shared my work I shared that paper specifically on a podcast to kind of get it to the folks that may not necessarily hear it. And so I'm trying to do a number of different things to kind of get the message into the community that, hey, we have strong African-American couples and they have information that they want to share. Because even in that paper, much of it was about being generative and giving this information to younger adults. The research suggests that older African-Americans desire marriage at the same rates as every other group. Yet they are much less likely to get married and even more less likely to stay married than their racial and ethnic counterparts. And so getting these messages out to the folks that it could actually help is a task, and it takes a little bit of partnering with the community, a little bit of getting creative in how we distribute the message beyond just a journal article. But I'm absolutely trying to do those things and welcome the opportunity to talk more with the community and kind of share my research more in a laid back environment as well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, and if you can either raise your hand, or if you have difficulty finding the raise hand, just unmute yourself and say something, and I'll recognize you.
Can you see my raised hand, Gray, or no?
Oh, is that Ann?
Yeah.
Okay, let's see. There we go.
Ready to go?
Yeah, ready to go.
Oh, okay. Dr. Skipper, one of the things that you mentioned was there's a link between Parkinson's and dementia, and I had not heard that. Can you just say something more about that?
The link is actually between Parkinson's and Alzheimer's specifically. And so those who experience Parkinson's are at a higher rate, a higher risk of developing Alzheimer's. And we do see that there is not always, of course, it's not causal at all, simply a correlation between, developing Parkinson's disease and then later starting to show signs of Alzheimer's disease.
All right. I didn't know that.
Dr. Skipper, how strong is that link?
I'm gonna see if I can look it up for you. I don't, because I'm not sure off the top of my head. I apologize.
Is it a genetic link?
No, I don't believe it's a genetic link.
Okay.
That's awesome. Yeah, I'll be more than happy to share the information with you. I don't have it right here in front of me, but I do know that there is certainly a correlation there.
Okay, Gretchen has her hand up.
Yes. Hi, Dr. Skipper. Just a great presentation. You mentioned something in passing early on when you were talking about ageism. It's a subject, of course, that we think about a lot, given the group we belong to. And it's a subject that came up a lot in the fall when we had the annual conference of the Association of Retirement Organizations in Higher Education. Among others, we had Louise Aronson as a keynote speaker talking about her book, Elderhood, and she talks a lot about ageist attitudes there. What I particularly wanted to ask about was how insidious ageist attitudes can be, even amongst us, you know, who like to think of ourselves as enlightened in this area, but also among doctors, even among gerontologists, right? That and thinking to do good, they just perpetuate some of these very negative stereotypes. And even we are apt to buy into them. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. So that's a great point. And it's important to note that under 1% of physicians are geriatricians, right? So very few people are kind of trained in this space. And the majority of older adults see a physician who is not a geriatrician or specifically trained in the area. I would often tell my students about a story of a gentleman who went to the doctor, and he said, you know, older gentleman, he says, "Hey doc, my left leg hurts." And the doctor says, "Oh, you know, you're just getting older. You know, it's expected. You're gonna have these aches and pains with age." And then he responds, "Well, that's funny because my right leg is the same exact age, but it doesn't hurt." And I think that really speaks to particularly ageism in the healthcare arena, whether it is kind of attributing things to age, whether it is, you know, you may accompany an older adult to the physician and they talk more to the caregiver than they do to the older adult, or they're almost behaving as if the older adult is even there while they're talking about them. And so, you know, ageism has become so thread in our society that in many ways people are not even recognizing when they're doing it. And as you share, we do it and we may not even, you know, take note of it. And so we may be speaking and we may say something, you know, we may have a forgetful moment and we may say, "Oh, give me just a second. I'm having a senior moment." Exactly. Never thinking that what we just said was completely ageist and inappropriate, right? That we are attributing forgetfulness to being an older adult. And so it's become so, you know, thread into our society again, and just so acceptable that one of the things that we really have to do is be more aware of it and call others out on it. Like, I know people look at me crazy because I will call you out on ageism like nothing. And you know, I was like, that's ageist, don't say that, or that's ageist, don't do that. But I think that we have to start somewhere and kind of reframing how we think about older adulthood. And we saw the gap or the issue with ageism increase significantly during the COVID-19 pandemic, right? Because all of the news was about age being a risk factor associated with COVID-19. And very early on, it became the old folks' disease, right? Let's protect the old people because they're the ones dying. And yeah, there was a relationship there between age and mortality in relation to COVID-19. But we've also seen lots of older adults experience COVID-19 and be just fine. And we've seen younger adults who did get COVID-19 and didn't make it. And so just kind of reframing that piece by piece and calling folks out on it and being aware of ageism. I mean, it's largely negative ageism, but there's positive ageism as well, where, you know, we may assume that because you're older, you're wiser. Not necessarily always the case. It's ageist to, you know, believe that anytime we tie a stereotype to, you know, being older, like, you know, it's still a stereotype. So I absolutely appreciate that comment and the opportunity to kind of talk with y'all and have y'all to join me in this battle against ageism as we work together to call people out on it.
Right, and have you join us. I mean, to some extent, that's what these retirement organizations are all about, to counter the impression that once you're retired, you head for the rocking chair.
Yes.
We don't continue to have all sorts of contribution to make to our institutions and our communities and all of that. And one thing our organizations can do is, come up with programming that will change the way we think ourselves and other people think.
Yes, I agree. Thank you.
Okay, Ted, I see your hand is up.
Okay. Dr. Skipper, I want to thank you for this great presentation and especially for what you just said about calling people out for ageism. I think you're a real ally. I actually have a couple of questions. I was very surprised. Did you say that caregivers have 70% greater mortality than non-caregivers?
Non-caregivers, yes. So and that study was over the course of it was a longitudinal study. I believe it was 7 years that they looked at mortality rate in serving as a caregiver. Now, it's important to remember that the caveat to that is the experience of caregiver burden and caregiver strain, right? Mm-hmm. Like that's the key piece. So simply serving in the role of caregiver is not going to be, enough to kind of contribute to that mortality risk or higher mortality risk. But when you are serving in that role and you are experiencing caregiver burden or caregiver strain, particularly a significant amount, that can then contribute to issues related to morbidity and mortality.
Mm-hmm. And the second thing I wanted to ask about, I saw a presentation a few years ago before the pandemic. I think it was at the Retiree Council from Georgia Tech, and they had a laboratory home they were developing with devices and monitors and things to help older people. What do you think of the prospects of technology improving and helping with, your first slide showed the age pyramid, and it is astounding how much that is changing and how many older people there are going to be. Do you think that technological innovation will help?
Absolutely. I think we're headed in that direction. We are at a point now where I think the stereotype before was that older people are not technologically engaged, right? And here we are, on Zoom, on WebEx, and everybody is, FaceTiming their loved one. And I think that, the use of technology and being older adult, like that stereotype is changing. And we're recognizing that people are technology savvy, that people can use technology across the life course, and that there are a number of resources out there. And I can't think of the name of that. Oh, so you mentioned the place at Georgia Tech, and I'm mad because I can't think of the name of it right now, but I'm very familiar with it. Is it
the Aware Home?
Is that what it is?
Actually, the presentation might have been at Georgia Hero. Anyway, it was in person, and I took notes on paper, and I can't find them right now.
Yeah, but
it was a laboratory home, and it had it monitored things like whether the oven had been left on.
Yes. And so I do believe that, we're going to get to a place where technology really kind of steps in and plays a role in helping people. There has to be something. As I shared, we're headed for a caregiver crisis. We have this booming number of older adults. And we have very few people that are following behind them that can actually serve in the caregiving role. And so there has to be something to kind of fill that space. We can't, the majority of people are not going to nursing homes. They're not going to assisted living. They don't need that level of care. They simply need a little bit of help to be able to continue to live in their home and age in place. And so I do believe that technology can play a role in assisting older adults with that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there were also devices that did things like monitor your gait, which I know some smartphones do too. And
yes.
So maybe there will be more advanced help before something happens, before someone falls
Absolutely.
or starts a fire because the stove is left on or something.
Yes. Yeah. They have the stoves that will detect a fire or detect smoke and turn itself off. I was amazed when I found out about the pill bottles that will send you a notification when it's opened. Very cool. But yeah, they have all of these little devices that, can be used now to help us take better care of those that we're caring for.
Thank you.
Okay, Beryl has her hand up. And you need to unmute yourself.
Thank you. Thank you very much for a great presentation. I'm curious about the vaccine refusal based on religion. Is there anything else that you could briefly tell us about that in your findings, preliminary?
Yeah, so it's still early on. I'm analyzing the data as I continue to collect data during the interviews. I was looking around, see if I have my interview packing up right now, so I don't see them. I'm trying to think what else really kind of popped out there. I'll tell you something that really kind of popped out in several of them was this notion of so it goes along with healthy eating, which I originally coded separately, right? Okay. I had them as two separate codes. And then I started to notice the connection between God has given us everything on this earth that we need to care for our bodies without the need of a vaccine. So that was one thing that kind of came up because I then did some axial coding where I said, well, hey, these things are kind of talking to each other. Like these things are related. And so there was quite a bit of talk about this notion of eating healthy and having the nutrients provided here on the earth to take care of every illness that we encounter. And I can't remember like the religious doctrine or the scriptures that they were sharing offhand, but I know it's coded in the interviews and they were actually sharing quotes from these religious scriptures that say you have everything that you need to cure illness here on earth. And so I thought that was pretty cool and interesting. But there were several things there that were kind of, again, religiosity was only one question, but there were several other, things that they would discuss, and then it would tie back to religion and health, religion and well-being. Religion is kind of this factor in whether they decided to get the vaccine or not.
All right. Thank you.
You're welcome.
And I'll just note that Meg Cooper put in the chat a link to relationship between Alzheimer's and Parkinson's. And Anne, did you have another question or comment? I know you're
No, I just wasn't sure if my raised hand was raised, so I think I did it 2 or 3 times.
Okay. Are there other questions or comments?
This is Gretchen. I'm about to put into the chat information about a wonderful talk we had at the Emeritus College earlier this spring. It's a woman called Annabelle Springer who does work on Alzheimer's at the Coulter Institute, which is a joint Tech Emory institute. And she came to talk to us. As I said, I'm going to put a description of her talk. And the talk was recorded and it is available on our Emeritus College website. But it's treatment that she and her fellow researchers have been working on, treatment for neurodegenerative disease, non-invasive treatment using what's called flicker, flicker of light and sound that I didn't know there were mice with Alzheimer's, but apparently there are. And with those creatures, but they've gotten a lot of funding. They're working now with human beings, and it's very promising. And they expect it to be helpful for all kinds of neurodegenerative issues. And again, if you're interested, I'm about to enter that into the chat. Thanks.
Gretchen,
Yes.
did she by any chance mention that they were still looking for people to participate in that project?
She might have. You could get in touch. I'll include her email, and you could get in touch.
And the only reason I'm asking is that I was asked to participate in that project, and I said no. And the reason is that it lasted for, you had to commit for 6 months or something like that, and do something on a weekly basis. And I just was not prepared to do that. But I know that they were looking for people to participate, and they were paying them at the end of this. Maybe it was longer than 6 months. It might have been a year. They were paying them $500 at the end, which might have been a big incentive for some, but I know that that it was a big commitment in not necessarily a lot of time, but a time over a long period.
Okay, Chuck, I see your hand is up.
Yes, hello everybody. Dr. Skipper, thank you so much. I'm in a 12-step support group recovery program, and a lot of meetings now are either Zoom and face-to-face hybrid types of meetings. But I was wondering for elderly folks who are just trying to combat isolation and loneliness, do you have any knowledge or insight about any research that's been done now that the pandemic has hit regarding is Zoom overall considered inferior to face-to-face meetings? Or can you share some knowledge about a comparison of the two types of venues and pluses and minuses of each? Thanks.
Yeah, that's a great point. So I do, I'm not familiar with research that specifically compares them, but I'm sure it's out there. But some points that I would like to make, like there are some programs that have used Zoom extensively to engage older adults. And these older adults have shared that it's been very helpful in countering isolation during the pandemic. So I'm thinking about Dr. Sanford Danziger. He has a program called Looking Forward. And I've sat in on one Looking Forward meeting, but I know they meet weekly. And his goal is simply to get older adults logged on to Zoom so that they can then just simply share, talk, and have some communication. If I had to choose which one I believe is more effective, particularly in thinking about long-term care, I go back to the work of Dr. Candace Kemp. She has an article called More Than a Caregiver. And it talks about how during the pandemic, we had, people that were FaceTiming their loved ones with, the nurses there or the aides there, people that were Zooming into their loved ones, but they weren't allowed to enter the facility. And having conversations with these folks, Dr. Candace Kemp recognized that the caregiver was more than a visitor, which is why she called the article that. She recognized that this is a key person on this care team that needs to interact with this older adult in person, because in face-to-face, because there are these positive outcomes that are associated with that. I mean, particularly if we think about memory care, could you imagine someone who is already dealing with Alzheimer's disease and all of a sudden they can't see the only familiar face that they know, or they can't, have the only familiar person that they know to visit with them. And so I really liked her argument in the More Than a Visitor article, and recognizing that, you know, continuing to be around people in a safe way is important during the pandemic. I mean, I'm consider myself to be fairly young, but Zoom fatigue is real. Like it is a real thing. And, you know, when we're on Zoom all day, every day, like sometimes we just want to be around people again and, you know, experience, you know, that face-to-face connection. I know the conferences that I've gone to here lately, they're like, can we hug? Like, is it okay if we hug? We just want to hug. Like, we know, are you good with the hug? And so I don't think that there's any substitute for face-to-face interaction and the intimacy that comes with just seeing people in person. And again, I'm not familiar with, you know, the details of any research that kind of compares the two, but if I had to guess, like, I don't think there's really any substitute from being together.
If I may, just a quick follow-up comment. One thing that I love about Zoom is I can look at a lot of different people's facial expressions and very quickly I can size up the room, so to speak. And if I'm sitting in a circle in a recovery group, I'm pretty much looking at just one or two or three faces across the room from me. So I really love that about Zoom.
Yes.
Of course, it can have its drawbacks too, but you can really see a lot of different people's reactions and thoughts and demeanors all at once, looking at the Zoom screen.
Absolutely. That can be a little nerve-wracking when you're presenting. So for good or bad,
yes.
Yeah, when you're presenting and reading the room and all of the faces are saying the same thing.
Okay, Ron has his hand up.
Thank you for an interesting presentation. A few months ago, I watched a documentary about a pediatrician in Atlanta who was still working at the age of 103. I wonder, have you focused on that group of people, people who live over 100, and come up with any observations, characteristics about them?
I have not specifically. In our program, who does centenarian work? Dr. Grace DeRosa does work with centenarians, but I think I know exactly what it is that you're talking about, because in it, he is talking about how he has cared for, you know, like the children of their children, of their children, of their children. And, you know, they're talking about how he's cared for entire families over the course of his career. So I haven't done any work specifically with those that are over 100. Much of my work has been with African Americans, which my argument is if we start studying African Americans at 65, we're about 30 years too late, simply because of the difference in life expectancy and things of that nature. So I normally capture people around 55, sometimes even as young as 50 based on the topic. But very, very interesting research to, you know, kind of understand what contributes to people living that longer or that long, I'm sorry. And also when thinking about continuing to practice, like, and sitting in this group, you know, one of the things that I argue in the classroom is that, you know, we got rid of forced retirement. Like, we did away with that, which is great. But in certain professions, like, you are still extremely effective into your 100s. You know, why are society oftentimes in its ageist ways tell people that, okay, it's time to move on. It's time for you to leave, you know, your profession. It's time to go on and retire. But as that story highlights, like, you can still be very effective in many professions well into 90 or 100 years of age.
Thank you.
Okay, are there other questions or comments?
I do have one comment. I don't know if you're willing to, I really enjoyed your presentation. I'm interested in some of the data that you presented. And I was wondering if you would be willing to share your slides, or at least share the one in the very beginning with the population changes that are going to occur over time and what the demographics look like.
Okay, absolutely. Yeah, I'll be more than happy to share those. And I guess
Thank you.
Shall I just send them to you, Ted?
And what I will say is that this meeting is being recorded, and Professor Skipper has already agreed that we can post that on our website. So once our amazing Carol Pope gets the recording all gussied up and ready, it will be on our website so that you can see it again or share it with any of your friends who would like to.
Perfect. Thank you.
But yes, Dr. Skipper, I'll be sending a post-meeting email to all the participants. Yeah.
Is the recording posted on a Facebook page or is it a standalone website?
It will be on the Georgia Hero website.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And there's recordings of our previous meetings there as well. So if there are no more questions or anything, on my behalf, I will certainly thank you, Professor Skipper, and I'll turn the meeting back over to Ted.
Okay. I was just looking, it's Georgia, it's, sorry, ga-hero.org. And when I'm finished talking, I'll post that in chat. So we're all thanking you, Dr. Skipper. This has been a very enlightening and perhaps also sobering presentation for us. It's a topic that people in our demographic have to be interested in. As I alluded to before, I've gone through it with my parents, and I can see declines in sensory perception and so forth in myself. And it's wonderful to have an opportunity to prepare for these things.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, I just wanted to, before I get off, just really thank you all and really share how it is such an honor to be in this room with you all. So many amazing scholars representing Georgia, you know, and all of the work that you all have done in your time in the academy. I aspire to get there. And so it really is, you know, an honor. It's my honor to be able to share this room with you all and sit in with Georgia Hero and just be able to share a little bit about my work and what it is that I'm doing. And so thank you. Thank you for all that you have done, because I truly recognize that I am, you know, standing on the shoulders of giants, and I'm just a small piece of all of the things that you all have already established. So thank you for that.
Can you unmute us? And we can all clap.
Oh, okay. Thank you. I appreciate it. So I guess I log off and you all go on with your meeting here. Is that how it works, Ted?
Yes, that's fine. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you. Y'all have a good one.
Okay.